Thank you all for inviting me to be part of the APN webinar series. You all run such a great program, and I'm so excited to see global interest in pragmatism. I'm going to share my screen here because I have a variety of nice images here that might help my message get people keep people awake. Uh, as Professor Lacey said, I'm looking at the story of pragmatism in India. And this has always interested me because, we all know about this story of Hu Shih and pragmatism in
Wow.
China. And of course, there's a lot of excitement in China now about what pragmatism meant for China, what it could mean in the future for China. And this is awesome. And Hu is usually a member of those stories. He of course studied with John Dewey at Columbia University and then goes back to China and eventually drags Dewey over there when Dewey was visiting Japan, and Dewey spent an ever-extending time in China. So we have this awesome story of the global reach of pragmatism, and we have this wonderfully detailed story that we continue to flesh out of pragmatism in China. But the question is, what about other countries? This is if it's global, it might be around the globe in other places. So, Hugh gives us kind of this insight to the power of Dewey. Whoever stumbled into Dewey's classes often heard a very boring lecturer. Dewey was by no means dynamic as a speaker, but if it was the right student, they got captivated by Dewey's message. And they went off and did something with that message or parts of that message. And this is what happened with Hu Shih in China, of course. He didn't replicate Dewey's philosophy in China. He creates his own version of pragmatism in China. And so, here's a recollection from Hu in 1975 when he says, Dewey's power, lay not only in his slow way of lecturing, but the fact that he was always throwing out and left and right these seed ideas, ideas which may fall on fertile soil in the mind of some of his students and grow into intellectual structures probably beyond the dream of the originator, John Dewey. So we saw that in China. We continue to explore that in China. But the question, again, that keeps coming to my mind as someone continually interested in the philosophical traditions dating back thousands of years in India, is there a story of pragmatism in India? Now, when I first started looking into this 10 years ago, I came across a name I had never really heard about before, a man named Bhimrao Ambedkar. And you start looking into Ambedkar's story, and you inevitably find this letter from 1952 quoted. Now, this is a letter he penned from New York City when he arrived a day or two after John Dewey just passed away. And he writes back to India to his second wife, Savita Ambedkar, that he was excited to see Professor Dewey, but he died. And he's so sorry because he owed his whole intellectual life to him. And then inevitably, work on Ambedkar says, this is because Ambedkar took classes from Dewey and was inspired by Dewey. And then they move on. So I early on got the hint that there was a story here about pragmatism in India, one that involved a teacher and a creative, innovative, powerful student, Bhimrao Ambedkar. But there was no details. No one had dove into this. So, and maybe in the West, this is, an understandable but unfortunate outcome because many in the West don't know about Ambedkar. So, for instance, if you're one of those that don't know about Ambedkar, if you haven't heard of him, here's a quick sketch of his life. And again, it's a wonderful story. It's a story that implicates politics, civil rights, activism, religion, and I want to add also pragmatism. So, if you look at his life, he was born in 1891. He was born as an untouchable. His caste was a Mahar, and that's technically an outcast. So his presence and his touch were ritually polluting in many contexts, or considered ritually polluting. He enrolled in a college there, Elphinstone College in Mumbai, and through hard work on his part and a little bit of luck, he gained the benefactor of a prince in Baroda, the Gaikwad, Sayaji Rao Gaikwad III, who had a tendency to, try to promote in his own political organization and his own social services and through his own educational endeavors, Dalit, untouchable individuals. So Sayaji Rao sends Ambedkar to Columbia University, funds his education in Columbia in 1913. Now, this was incredibly important because everyone else that was in the US from India at that time I could almost guarantee you they were upper caste individuals like Gandhi and Nehru, and they went, almost exclusively to the universities of the empire in, the UK, Cambridge, Oxford, etc. So Ambedkar, for some reason, ended up at Columbia University in the heart of America, not the old country that was running the empire. And he ended up in classrooms of some of the leading progressive teachers of his era. Now, he was there to study politics and economics, but we'll see in a second, somehow he ended up in Dewey's classes, and this was a Pakal. Now, when he comes back to India, he ends up leading social protests, somewhat allied with Gandhi's social movement across the nation of India. But, he ends up breaking famously with Gandhi in the 1930s because he believed Gandhi didn't support the untouchables in the way he should. And so he breaks with Gandhi and starts leading his own movement to gain civil rights and protections for India's untouchables. In the 1940s, much to his credit, Nehru, the first prime minister of India, appoints Ambedkar's law minister and puts him in charge of drafting or leading the drafting committee for India's constitution, even though they strenuously disagreed on some issues. So Ambedkar had a hand in the 40s with the constitution that made India the world's largest democracy. By the 1950s, Ambedkar largely falls out of politics because of disagreements with Nehru, and he turns towards religious activism as a form of social activism. And so famously, Ambedkar rewrites the Buddha's story. He creates his own Buddhist Bible, as he would call it, the Buddha and his Dhamma, and he reconstructs Buddhism. He creates a conversion ritual and converts a few weeks before he dies in 1956 in a dusty field in Nagpur with 500,000 of his Dalit followers also converting to Buddhism. This is supposedly the world's largest voluntary mass conversion. So, a wonderful narrative arc to his life, one of powerful political activity, religious conviction, and social engagement. But again, the question keeps coming back to what about the Dewey side of this? What about the pragmatist implications of this story? So many people have told this story and have not mentioned the word pragmatism. So, what new aspects can we add to this story? So, this has driven me over the last 10 or 12 years. I've been to India. Some of my best friends are over in India. And I've seen the living legacy of the Ambedkarite movement and all the sites, and I've tried to glance and look through every book Ambedkar touched and every notebook he penned to try to get into the mind of this incredibly complex individual. And I have gained a great respect for Ambedkar not only as an object of philosophical study, but also as a religious figure and a civil rights icon that continues to inspire the people looking for equality in India. And this, culminated in a lot of detail, but perhaps boring detail in my book in 2023, The Evolution of Pragmatism in India. So today, though, I want to start talking about some of that story and some of the story that lies beyond that book, which loosely can be diagrammed like this. When we talk about the fate of pragmatism in India, what are we pointing at? What are we talking about? Well, there's a sense where we can talk about history of reception of pragmatism in India. We can talk about the origin of how pragmatism ends up in India, what happens to it once it's there, what Indian thinkers like Ambedkar rejected or extended, etc. We could also talk about the constructive application of pragmatism to India and its problems. For instance, pragmatism in the form of John Dewey has a great respect for education and its role in democracy. So India is like the United States. It has an incredibly pluralistic democracy that gets chaotic at times, gets agonistic, and very aggressive at times. So in many ways, its problems of divisions are America's problem of division. And pragmatism has something to say in both contexts. Can we dream up new ways of bridging those divisions? Pragmatism might give us those resources. So today I want to talk a little bit about both of these aspects. But again, they're separate. And projects today are pursuing both Ambedkar's history as a pragmatist and also the future applications of pragmatism in India. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. This has been an interesting feature of the reception in India to my project and my book on Ambedkar as a pragmatist. And it's very much made me think of what's the use in calling Ambedkar a pragmatist? Why use this kind of term? And there, like I said, there's been interesting scholarly uptake and engagement on pragmatism as a term and tradition and its connection to Ambedkar. Ambedkar, of course, is very well known in India. Pragmatism, on the other hand, as a form of American philosophy, is not very well known. So some folks will, mischaracterize pragmatism as, almost like Bertrand Russell did in the 1910s, and then reject it because of that simple characterization. Some folks will, see it as this kind of new way of talking about important figures like Ambedkar and embrace it in an exciting fashion. And again, some of the reception has not only simplified, but it's simplified in a very pejorative way. For instance, press releases were released shortly after my book dropped, and claiming, for instance, claiming that pragmatism is a pseudoscience and it can't be falsified. These things don't discourage me that much because as we push this debate forward more, people will start to realize the complexity of the American pragmatist tradition and the complexity of its reception in places like China and India, and see it's not simply a matter of a scientific philosophy. Another interesting kind of point of tension is when you talk about Ambedkar and his relation to Dewey, oftentimes, and you call Ambedkar a pragmatist, oftentimes people will gloss this approach and say, well, you're reducing Ambedkar to Dewey's philosophy. And I think that part of this reaction comes from the idea that philosophies and philosophical traditions or darshanas in India are very, to an extent, very, walled off. They're homogenous. Buddhists believe certain core things, Advaita Vedantins believe certain core things, and, never the twain meets at a certain point, or you become the other school. However, when we know what we know about pragmatism, of course, James is not the same as Dewey. Dewey is not the same as Du Bois. Du Bois is not saying the same thing as Mary Kingsbury Simkovich, yet we have reason to consider all of these individuals part of this diverse and sometimes contradictory tradition of pragmatism. So calling Ambedkar pragmatist by no means demeans his creativity. It gives us a new way to see his creativity. And it's by no means an act of American imperialism. In many ways, Ambedkar expands, just like Hu Shih does, what we think of as the possibilities of Dewey's philosophy. And they both expand our understanding of the weaknesses of Dewey's philosophy because they add things that Dewey was clearly lacking. One thing that I have tried to emphasize in my work and my speeches and such in India, of course, is the complexity of these thinkers we're dealing with. And this is, if someone says Ambedkar's philosophy is different from Dewey's philosophy, this is obviously kind of a shortcut, right? Because Dewey's philosophy spans 8 million words in his collected works. And, Dewey didn't believe the same thing at every time. And even in given periods like the 1910s, his thought had certain tensions or contradictions. Ambedkar was the same. Ambedkar, penned 4 million words at least in English, plus many things in Marathi and other, languages in India. And, he didn't always think the same thing and he didn't always spell out the same theory to different audiences. So these thinkers are very complex and we must be very careful when we say Ambedkar's philosophy as if it's one thing or Dewey's philosophy as if it's one thing. So what I want to do today is start to look at the kind of complexity of pragmatism and the complexity of pragmatism as it is received by Indian thinkers like Bhimrao Ambedkar. So when I call Ambedkar a pragmatist, I mean that he takes part in a historical tradition of influence and interaction, not just copying, but people that read each other, parts of each other's corpus, react to those parts, extend some, reject others. This is what we mean, of course, when we say Peirce and Dewey are pragmatists. Peirce and Dewey had strenuous disagreements on things like logic, let's say, but we still consider them part of this tradition. And then there's also a sense where we can say there are conceptual similarities among these thinkers, like the belief in experience as important, the belief in equality, or democracy as something going all the way down to our habits of interaction. So you could say there's conceptual similarities among these individuals. It obviously does not mean these individuals all say the same thing. And another interesting thing is pragmatism is not such a hard and fast, walled off school label that it precludes other things. James was a psychologist. James and Dewey were both Christians, but they were also pragmatists. So now let's turn to the questions or the different ways of asking these questions about the fate of pragmatism in India. And we'll focus on, for the bit here, the first part of my presentation, on the historical story. And then we'll move to the second part, which is exciting, I think, in its own right. So let's look at the origins of pragmatism in India. What can we say about this beyond that letter and beyond a vague statement that Ambedkar liked Dewey's classes? Well, to tell that story about the origins of pragmatism in India, we have to go back to Columbia University in 1913 to 1916. And this is where young Ambedkar, even though he signed an order with the Prince of Baroda, Sayaji Rao, that he would only take classes in the political economy department, he somehow stumbled in to Dewey's philosophy classes. Uh, what more can we say about those classes? We don't have his diaries, right? So, it's tough to get into that black box of his education. And so, what you'll see in a second is I have tried to get into that education in various ways. But one thing we can say with certainty was Dewey was on Ambedkar's mind. Here you have a scrap of paper that's jammed in the back of one of Ambedkar's copies of Dewey's books that he owned. You see, he purchased it the first semester he took a class with Dewey in 1914. And, it took me a few visits to notice this scrap of paper. It looked just like something he was blotting his beloved fountain pens on. But you notice there, next to that blot of ink from his pen, he was doodling. And what was he doodling? He was doodling philosophical terms that confuse students to this day, like manifold in Kant. And he was also doodling his famous signature, that evolved over the years, just like his thought. But he was also doodling John. So John Dewey was on his mind. John Dewey was at the tip of his pen as well. But we can find other clues that lead us to new stories if we are open to them. There's a tendency with great thinkers like Ambedkar or Dewey to say the same thing over and over again because it's accepted, it must be true. But for Ambedkar, there's a lot of novelty to discover. So one of those aspects to discovering new facts came when I started looking at the recollections of students from Dewey's class. Dewey, like Ambedkar, was famous. So famous people or well-known people, get other people to write down the recollections with them. So I started to try to get access into Dewey's classes by looking at the recollections from various thinkers. And I came across one that no one else has noticed before by a philosopher and activist named Nima Adler-Blum. She spent about 20 years as a student of Dewey's. She would take his classes, she would sit in on them, the same classes, year in, year out. She lived right next to the university. She finally publishes her dissertation on Jewish philosophy in 1926 and officially gets the degree. But she was a long-term admirer of Dewey's philosophy, especially as he was promulgating it at Columbia. Her husband was a student of the advisor, Seligman, of Ambedkar. So, I came across her recollection and I started reading it. And, I, of course, came across a paragraph where she talks about, she's writing this recollection in the 60s. So, 50 some years after she was actually at Columbia. And she writes about many students she met from Japan and China. And this is known that Dewey had these kind of students, and that was exciting. But my heart almost stopped when she started talking about one student from India. Now, she never names this student, but this is the passage where she talks about this student from India. And he's always with pen and paper, and he was always reading Dewey's articles, and he recopied the class notes after each lecture. And whenever he read them to Nima, he sounded just like Dewey himself talking. Uh, Now, more importantly, the student from India showed Neem Adler-Blum his attached comments, searching for a bridge between Dewey and Buddhism. Both, the student said, aim at the highest morality, but Dewey's drive for a good society might be more conducive to happiness than nirvana. In the United States, he met Dewey, who gave a new turn to his life. In infusing Dewey's concept of an idealistic democracy, this Indian student may be of some help in easing the ugly ingrained tradition of the untouchables. Now, as I argue in my book, this student must be Ambedkar. For instance, because, and I go over more of this in my book, there are no other Indian students of Dewey that I can find. And all the Indian students, there are not many of them, but yeah, all the Indian students at Columbia were fixated like a laser on the issue of self-rule for India. No one in the 1910s really, made their number one, challenge to India the challenge of caste and untouchability. Okay, so this had to be Ambedkar, and what this letter, this recollection from the 1910s, is opening up for us is the fact that young Ambedkar was committed to Buddhism in the 1910s, but not just Buddhism as it was received, a Buddhism that was merged with parts of Dewey. So this gives us a fascinating new opening. What can we say about pragmatism in India and the novelties and the syntheses that it encourages? Now, let me talk for a second about the reception of Dewey, because again, to talk about pragmatism in India means to a certain extent to focus on Dewey. What the folks in India heard, took there, rejected, extended, changed, etc. So when you look at Ambedkar and his reception of Dewey, there are three vectors. One, the courses he took with Dewey. Second, the books he read from Dewey. And three, the kind of creative engagement with the ideas, or as Hu said, the seed ideas that Dewey left him in either courses or books. Now, when it comes to the courses, we have Ambedkar's transcripts and we have Columbia's bulletins from those days. And so we can correlate these two and quickly find out that Ambedkar took three courses from Dewey. Philosophy 231 on psychological ethics. He didn't take the second half of that course in the spring. And he took the whole two-course section, sequence in 1915 to 1916, moral and political philosophy. Now that, by the way, is the class that Hu Shih also took from Dewey. I've dug through Hu Shih's recollections, and I know when Dewey taught that class, and so I know for certainty that that is the semester, 1915, 1916, those two semesters, that's when Hu Shih took Philosophy 131, 132. So in many ways, the grand told or untold stories of pragmatism in China and India all began in that little seminar room in the fall of 1915. Now, what did Ambedkar learn in these classes? Many folks say Ambedkar took so many classes, he learned so many things. But the real scandal, I think, is that, as scholars, we don't have any access to what he learned in these classes. The assumption typically is what academics were writing on, like their books, must be what they're teaching in class. But that's clearly false in many cases. So I've dug through the archives at the Dewey Center in Carbondale, Illinois, and I found the lecture notes from these classes, both by Dewey and by students. So I have a very good idea what he heard day by day in these three courses. Matter of fact, in some of the courses in 1915, the note takers, the student note takers that left us some extensive notes from every day of this class, they were absent. And you could kind of, if you're attending to details, you notice that some of the substitute note takers put their name down. And so a couple of the days, Ambedkar is the substitute note taker. So we know with great certainty what Ambedkar heard. And what he heard in these classes was Dewey's kind of emerging naturalistic philosophy of the 1910s. Habit, intelligence reform mattering when it comes to psychology and ethics. In the class that he shared with Hu, he heard Dewey's, interesting take on political philosophy and even economics and philosophy. And part of that class that really stands out to me is the kind of segue Dewey makes from habits as individual psychological features of existence to customs, the habits, at a group level that turn into prohibitions in a social sense or even turn into law when they're codified by a government. He also hears in that important class the distinction between forces energy and forces violence. This is when Dewey was cheerleading for World War I. And Hu Shih also hears this. So of course, Hu Shih has some important work on force and its constructive employment and pacifism, etc. So Dewey sets Ambedkar and Hu up, with some seed ideas here. Again, not ideas that are taken, simply and extended, but things to think about, things to extend, things to change. Now, after 1916, I have found absolutely no evidence that Ambedkar or Dewey corresponded with each other or attempted to correspond with each other. But Ambedkar continued to keep up on what Dewey was doing. How he did that was through Dewey's books. So going through about 7 different archives in India, from private collections to universities that preserve Ambedkar's library remains, I've been able to, create this list, which is, I think, the most complete list of the books on or about or by Dewey in Ambedkar's possession. These are books we know Ambedkar owned. These are the exact copies. Some of them, like Democracy and Education, Ambedkar had four copies of. So you can kind of see that these range all through Ambedkar's life. Up into the 1950s, Ambedkar was keeping track of what Dewey was writing and thinking, even if he wasn't talking with Dewey. And some of these books are the most extensively underlined or annotated books in all of Ambedkar's collection. So, for instance, Democracy and Education, a book that Ambedkar had four copies of the same book. Two are heavily annotated. You have passages like this. This is probably Ambedkar's favorite line in all of Dewey's writings. By the way, there are about 22 books by or about Dewey in Ambedkar's collection. No other author, modern author, is as represented. Not Marx. Marx, there's three books by. Dewey, is just stands out as someone that Ambedkar invested a lot of time and money in collecting the works of. So, you have here, Ambedkar underlining this in four different styles, which, now that I, studied this so much, I now realize that what was happening most likely was Ambedkar, each time he sat down with a book, he'd often be at a different table in his house with different pens and pencils. And, he would underline it. So what this means is he sat down with this book at least four times and marked this at least four different times. That's how much this passage kind of struck him about democracy as an individual way of life. Now, quickly, there's a lot to say on how this affected Ambedkar, and I want to get into some new aspects that I haven't talked much about before, but clearly Ambedkar's main target throughout his whole life of activism and also philosophy, right? He wrote books, he wrote articles, he wrote pieces in newspapers, but one of his consistent targets was the caste system, a graded hierarchy of essential, kind of meaning and often occupational demands by people that were set at birth. So he was born into the Mahar caste, and maybe in the next life he would be born into a different caste. But for this life, he could not change caste or get out of the implications of that essential caste structure. So in the 1930s, when he breaks with Gandhi, he, redoubles his critique of the caste system. And, what I've noted in my book is that in many ways, his critique of the caste system is an extension of Dewey's psychology of habit. Because when he starts talking about the problems of caste, he doesn't talk about structures or institutions primarily. He very often breaks it down to individual habits. And so he famously says in 1936, caste is a notion, it's a state of mind. He also says in that same very important speech in 1936 that, reform of the caste system is going to have to deal with the inner things of human psychology, and these are what build to the customs of caste and group behavior. So you must deal as a reformer with the mental attitudes and habits of people towards men and things. And what he means here are the ways that Indians of his day would see someone not as a person, but as a certain member of a caste. Those are habits in Ambedkar's mind. And, that's very much what Dewey would say. Dewey didn't know much about caste. He knew some about caste. But, that's the kind of extension of this naturalistic psychology. Ambedkar, like Dewey, also had this view of reflection as being a key aspect to the reform or change of habits, of meaning, and of social structures. So in that same speech, you see him praise reflective thought, and he gives a similar pragmatist story. The reflection only occurs in situations where a crisis provokes it. It's not, you're not always reflecting on certain things. So, he saw moments like his speech, Annihilation of Caste, as a chance to encourage that reflection among would-be reformers. Now let's segue to another aspect of Ambedkar's thought, that of the future that we can see in this. And one thing that I found fascinating about Ambedkar's form of pragmatism, navayana is a term he used once. Many of his followers, not all, use it to describe his form of Buddhism, navayana Buddhism. I love using this to describe his form of pragmatism because it shows how his form of pragmatism is a novel entry in the global catalog of different people we call pragmatists. So let's talk about Navayana pragmatism, democracy, and moral ideals. Now, moral ideals are always a challenge for pragmatists, right? There's a question is what are moral ideals? There's the question of how they are justified. Where do they come from? How do these ideas even spring up in our mind such that we can justify them? So these are important questions for pragmatists. These are important questions for Ambedkar. When you start looking at what you would consider the ideals of Ambedkar's pragmatism, you repeatedly come across these three terms. You come across fraternity, equality, and liberty. Of course, these are three terms we know from the French Revolution. They appear in his Marathi speeches. You could translate them in various ways, but you see how the conceptual structure are these three things. Um, you see them in Dewey's class, right? Interestingly enough, Dewey doesn't make a sustained use of these three terms, although Dewey clearly knew about them. But they become very important terms for Ambedkar. But if you look at the notes from the classes we have that Ambedkar took with Dewey, you see in March of 1916, Dewey talks about him for about 10 minutes in his class, and then he moves on. But obviously something stuck with Ambedkar because we see these terms appear in the preamble to the Indian Constitution, a preamble written in English, a preamble that Ambedkar took a very heavy hand in drafting. He was either leader of the drafting committee. He was one of the few that didn't die at some point during the drafting of the Constitution or move on and leave the committee. So he was, a very heavy force in this. And you see these terms in that Constitution of India. You see these in the Buddhist gospel, the Buddha and his Dhamma that he pens at the end of his life. It ends up getting published a year after he dies, but he finished it about 1955, right before he died. You see Buddha as teaching a gospel of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So you see these all over. In 1949, he gives us some philosophical insight to his use of these concepts. In a speech in 1949, he talks about social democracy and political democracy. And he says, look, we're going to have a constitution that gives us a political democracy, but it'll only survive if we have at the basis of it a social democracy. Of course, this is a very pragmatist move, right? Dewey talks about democracy as an associated mode of life, not as a form of government. So Ambedkar is extending this seed idea, but then he does something that Dewey never does. He resolves the notion of social democracy into these three ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity as principles of life. And he says they form a union or a trinity. And this trinity is fascinating because it's one of equality among these three. He can't, he continues in this passage that you can't reduce these to one thing. You can't say equality is the more important value. So you start getting this fascinating puzzle of ideals that Ambedkar holds and puts forward in his philosophy and his advocacy. But we still wonder, what role do they play in his pragmatism? So my current work is fleshing this out, because Ambedkar, I believe, is a philosopher as much as he is an activist. And, we see in this philosophy of Ambedkar this new ideal of social democracy, which I would put as this. It's basically an individual or a group way of life, which means a habit of interacting with other people, not just vote counting every few years. And it's a way of life that instantiates a balance among those values, not one that just focuses on one or two of those values, but it balances those and tries to deal with the tension among those. Now, this is, you can find many forms of support among this kind of gloss in the text on Ambedkar. For instance, in the 1940s, he writes a piece that was never published, but he explicitly says in Philosophy of Hinduism that justice is simply another name for liberty, equality, and fraternity. So think back to that Constitution first page of the preamble. He says justice, liberty, equality, fraternity. So you start to see the conceptual relationship among these ideals. Justice is the state of balancing between freedom, let's say, equality of all these people that are free, and the fraternity or fraternal sympathetic feeling among these individuals that are free and equal. So balance is a key goal in this ideal. But we still are left with the perplexing philosophical idea of justification. Where do these ideals come from, and how are they justified? Now, if you think about Dewey's, reading of philosophical ideals, moral ideals, let's say, is complex, but it's pretty clear. Dewey was very skeptical on ideals in any transcendental sense. So in his early idealist phase, neo-idealist phase, he was still very skeptical of Kantian philosophy, let's say in the 1890s, 1880s, and the Kantian philosophy of that day that would separate the ideal from the real. And later on in his life, when he changes to a more full-throated naturalism, he still continues to criticize moral and even aesthetic philosophies that separate ideals or things like beauty from the present because they'll devalue the present. So basically, there's four reasons why Dewey was skeptical of ideals. One is that they devalue the present, they devalue the means, because they get us so focused on something way out there. That thing that's way out there, perhaps in a Platonic realm, Kantian pure reason, heaven, etc., also doesn't let us usefully engage the present because it's so remote. This is a Hegelian form of critique of Kantianism. He also thinks there are motivational problems. If we firmly believe in moral ideals as something far away, something we aspire to but perhaps never can get to, we might become fatalistic. I can't ever be perfect like my Father in heaven is perfect, for instance. Why try? That's one of Dewey's kind of worries about moral ideals and religious ideals, even. And that kind of timeless certainty is unrealistic to an ever changing present. So Dewey had many problems with ideals. And what you see is Dewey's reading of where moral ideals come from is actually quite straightforward. Dewey, in places like Democracy and Education, and Bedkar annotates this passage. He says the ideal simply doesn't repeat the present. It's really a coalescing, a selective appropriation of key parts of the present that you then expand into this moral ideal. So it's some of the good stuff of the present that you make the ideal for improving the present. And he repeats this in A Common Faith in the 1930s and other places. So he naturalizes moral ideals. So, in other words, Dewey firmly believes if you have ideals or values in philosophy, they ought to come from experience, the experience of individuals or a community of individuals, and they largely come from custom, just the right customs that are helpful. They do not come from transcendental sources on Dewey's account. Now, the challenge for Ambedkar when he was hearing Dewey opine on this stuff in 1910s and reading this later on in his life and marking it is this. If we take this kind of non-transcendental approach to ideals, oftentimes the things we grab in our community context will be tainted by bad habits. And, Ambedkar was in a situation, a cultural context that was saturated by traditions that stretched back 3,000 years to the Vedas that had caste, according to Ambedkar, imbued in that kind of social milieu. So, put simply, Ambedkar didn't have many good features of his current context and the customs of his current context to drag out of and make bigger in order to rectify that context. So, and you see the kind of pragmatist paradox Ambedkar's in the 1950s. He pins this work and he explicitly talks about how philosophy, comes from the problems of life, but has to bend back and have use its theories to reconstruct those problems of life. So Ambedkar was in this paradoxical situation. He wanted his philosophy to reconstruct a caste, structured society, one where people had the habits of seeing each other in this graded hierarchy of value based upon birth and essential qualities. Yet he could not see many resources in that cultural context to drag from, to rectify it, to reconstruct it. So, if you start looking at Ambedkar's deployment of these ideals, you start seeing curious things. So, for instance, in that Annihilation of Caste speech, he proposes as an alternative to Chaturvarna, the kind of caste structured essentialist view of society with social hierarchies based upon birth or inner quality. He says, my ideal will be one of liberty, equality, fraternity. And then he says odd things like, and why not? And then you see the further refusal of justification games in that same text when he continues on talking about each of these values in particular. So, for instance, fraternity, he says, what objections could there be? I can't imagine any objections. So, notice, his kind of appeal to these values is interesting and new. He doesn't play the typical philosophical game of deriving values from some kind of knockdown proof. Instead, you start to see he, interestingly enough, propose these ideals, these values, and point out that there's a lack of objection to them or a lack of a counter ideal that one might be tempted to take. So the question could be this: what justifies these ideals? Ambedkar could be implicitly drawing upon an explanation like Dewey's explanation in Three Independent Factors, that famous essay from around 1930, where Dewey says, these moral systems or theories have roots and aspects of common experience. So, for instance, you might think behind Ambedkar's appeal to these are a respect for our experience of impulses to act, liberty, this equal desire for consideration like our fellow humans, equality, and the need for support from others. Call that fraternity. But you don't see Ambedkar make appeals to that kind of, reading of this. Interestingly enough, in the 1950s, when he's in the midst of his conversion campaign, he starts to make a different kind of, gesture and justification. He says, "Oh, I got these not from the French, but from my master, the Buddha." But of course, these aren't terms in Buddhism. These are English translations of the French motto. And of course, Ambedkar would be the first to tell you they're not justified simply because the Buddha said them. That would be a transcendental form of justification. So many ways, don't get distracted by the speech where he says he got these from this source or got them from another source. The interesting thing I want to, argue is how they function in his pragmatism. So you start to look at his philosophy as he spells it out in the last decades of his life. And you see he has this pragmatist aversion to timeless ideals. So the caste system, which in its Vedic form would talk about varnas or colors or essences of individuals, but still the same sort of essentialism is there. He thinks these things are problematic, like Dewey would say they were problematic. They make timeless something that is not truly timeless. Okay, they give sacredness that kind of gives something a fixity, but there's something problematic with that. Namely, the world is always evolving, and that kind of fixity benefits some people and not other people. So what we start to see here is interesting, right? So instead of the choice between non-transcendental sources of ideals in moral thought and political thought, or transcendental sources like God, the eternal word of the Veda, or Jesus's teachings, or Kant's appeal to pure reason, or Plato's Platonic realm of the forms, Ambedkar carves out a middle ground, what I call semi-transcendent source of ideals. And this is the idea that the source of ideals comes from some context of experience. So it's kind of like non-transcendental sources, but it's not one's own context. It's not inferred from the context one is surrounded by, like Dewey would have you do. Now, this is an interesting, change from what Dewey's approach would be. So, what I will submit to you is that these ideals in Ambedkar's pragmatism come not from any kind of knockdown philosophical argumentation, but they rely heavily on voluntarism, on the individual's willfulness and imagination. So, think about individual agency. Dewey, talked about early in his life a notion that he called personality, but he left that behind after 1904 when he became more of a naturalist. Ambedkar, however, throughout his whole life, loved that term of personality. And so in various works, he would talk about the battle against caste as a battle to reclaim human personality. So what does he mean by personality? That's a complex story, but what it meant was the kind of respect and enabling of the agency of individual concrete people like himself that were pinched by the caste system. And he was continually interested in how theories in India helped or harmed individual personality or individual agency. So, for instance, in a 1948 copy of this book that Ambedkar owned, no other marks are in it, but you get the idea that Ambedkar, you get the idea of what he was interested in from the table of contents page, and I give you an image of that here. You see Ambedkar writing in his own hand in a book on karma and rebirth. What place has will and effort in the law of karma? So Ambedkar was incredibly sensitive to doctrines like karma that would take away an individual's a chance to improve their lot in life or even improve society. And he saw caste and the underwriting logic of karma that explained why one had a certain inner essence or inner quality or inner color, that these things took away individual agency and therefore took away individual personality. You see this willfulness, this valuing of willfulness and will, even in the iconography of his work. So, for instance, the Buddha and his Dhamma, Ambedkar took, this was his Buddhist gospel. He rushed at the end of his life to finish this, and thank the gods he did. But it's a wonderful book, but he took care in how it even looked. So, in the corner of every page, he has a mudra, a hand gesture, the same one for all the pages. And what's fascinating is there's a 1940s book called, in the collection at Siddharth College called The Iconography of the Tibetan Buddhist Tradition or something like that. And, you literally see Ambedkar, through his annotations, selecting what icon he would put in this Buddhist gospel. And of course, there were two marks by two mudras, Abhaya, which means protection or blessing, or Tarjani, which means menacing. Which one do you think he picks for his Buddhist gospel, his Buddhist Bible, his Buddhist Dhamma? He picks Tarzani. In every corner of this book, that mudra is there. So Ambedkar's Buddhism was an aggressive one. It was an assertive one. It was one that demanded social change when social change was called for. Now, later in his life too, he paid attention to what Dewey said about things like will. Interestingly enough, and I need to write more on this. He knew about William James. He owned a variety of William James's works, and so here you see a 1913 copy of William James's famous, very well distributed book, Talks to Teachers on Psychology. And you see Ambedkar's marginal notations. But what interests me is that he's noting the passages of James that cohere with this idea of willfulness. In these passages, I'll just summarize them. James is talking about, if you have inclinations or instincts or impulses that are getting you habits that are getting you into trouble, it's harder just to say, don't do that. It's much easier to replace that outgoing impulse with another impulse. So this is the use of will in an intelligent fashion in reforming and reconstructing our life. So, what Ambedkar noticed that we know through these annotations is this very pragmatist ideal in James and in Dewey that we can use concepts, we can use, religions even, like Buddhism, as ways to reconstruct ourselves and hopefully reconstruct society. So, in summary, if you ask me, what does Navayana pragmatism say about moral ideals, and what novel suggestions does it have in explaining moral ideals? I'd put these 3 points in front of you. One, Navayana pragmatism, the pragmatism of Ambedkar, sees ideals as appropriative. They don't need to come from your context, but they come from some context. They don't have any kind of aura of sacredness to them. They are things that can be changed. Two, their justification resides in their use, in their consequences. Do they work for you? Do they inspire you to do the work necessary to achieve, let's say, a better social democracy, one animated by equality, etc.? So I think this is why Ambedkar refuses the game of justification. And he'll say things like, and why not? He's trying to get the listeners and readers of these speeches to think about the use of these ideals, not the argument for them and their correctness. Three, their social justification resides in their effects. So I've made a point in my work to really emphasize Ambedkar is also a rhetorical thinker, someone who adjusts his ideas to his audience and tries to adjust his ideas to his audience to his ideas. So, he gives these speeches with a purpose. He's trying to persuade certain audiences to do certain things. And so when we look at moral ideals, we have to keep this in mind. His use of these ideals is to get people to act or think in certain ways, whether that's to treat others with respect of fraternity or equality, or whether when he speaks to his own Dalit constituencies to get them to think of themselves as valuable and equal and claim that equality through the conversion to Buddhism. So there's so much more to say on Navayana pragmatism and the story and the fate of pragmatism in India. If I had to put his larger philosophy beyond ideals into 5 points, these are what I would say. Ambedkar's pragmatism sees human nature as contingent and changeable. He also sees the human personality as emerging out of this conflict or engagement between individual organisms with habits and social groups with customs and more aggregate ways of behaving. He has a valuable role for communication in this, including his own communication as a way to willfully change society. He sees the ideals as social democracy, which resolves into equality, liberty, and fraternity in a tense balance that's never quite set. And he also sees a variety of means to achieve this, from legal action to individual conversion to Buddhism. So there's much more to say about the fate of pragmatism in India, and hopefully I've just given you some insights or like starting points, perhaps my own seed ideas, that there's more to be said here, and I encourage folks to continue to look at the global reach and evolution of pragmatism in China, Japan, Africa, and India. Thank you for your attention.
All right. All right. Thank you very much, Scott. Very fascinating lecture, not just only on the topic of Ambedkar, but also touched on some key themes that are core for APN, anyone working with developing pragmatism in Asia. So I really liked how you talked about this isn't a matter of reducing an Asian thinker or activist to Western philosophy, and the contrary, is actually a way of also critiquing a Western tradition or expanding it and so
Yeah,
on. But let's open up the floor, questions and comments from our participants.
sure.
Who would like to go first? All right, Tad. Let's see.
Yes. Hello, Scott.
Hey.
I what I like about this is that every time I feel like I'm done with pragmatism, I can hear something like this, and it sounds like there's a little bit of hope. And I'll tell you the problem I have, and then the way I think you might have helped me work through it a bit. When you encounter the term pragmatism in the United States, it seems to be a restrictive idea, especially when it is
Yeah.
applied to electoral politics. So idealism gets excluded. There's a pragmatic objection to an idea. And so what ends up happening is the centrism itself, an ideology, comes into power in that sense. And so what I'm glad to hear with Ambedkar is his taking from Dewey the important part of it's really about habits and of the people. It's not a political system, it's an openness. Democracy begins with an openness to ideas. Um, and it's only in the customs and the institutions that it can become turned around in sort of an evil, sinister way to be a restricting of ideas. So I'm a little disappointed then whenever I hear Dewey talk about, well, being against ideals. I think the question is perhaps that he wasn't so much against ideals as that the people who are idealistic were difficult to talk to.
Yeah.
They're difficult to have conversations with. Um, so what I'm kind of wondering here is um, when we talk about pragmatism in Asia, and we want to avoid the imperialistic sort of idea of this, and we think of pragmatism as something that's sort of been exported to these other countries, is what is being picked up the good side of it, this deliberative democracy, this almost anarchistic idea of focusing on the human personalities, or is it being seen as a kind of way of promoting some sort of stability among the institutions and excluding ideas that would be, for example, outside the political mainstream? So I guess my question ultimately is with Ambedkar and your experience of being in India and Asia, do you see that what the good pragmatism is being taken up over there, or am I still in despair?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I might resist the idea that there's a good pragmatism and a bad pragmatism, but um, yeah, and again, you could think of like, are we ta telling a story about what was received, regardless of its value, or are we telling a story about, are they or are we engaging democracy in the right way, the good way? But yeah, the fascinating thing is that Ambedkar resisted a variety of things that Dewey would take as like granted in good pragmatism. So, for instance, Dewey, and of course, finding how a thinker resists another thinker is tough because not often do we say someone said this, but I'm gonna not agree to that. We ignore it. So what's fascinating is you look at those lecture notes from 1915-16. Again, the class that inspired Hu Shih and Ambedkar. And Dewey is kind of postulating this ideal that the individual, rests in a dialectic with community. These are the things that animate his basically history is fascinating. I think Dewey being famous would be just opining his philosophy, but what he does in that class, and we know it without speculating because we have the notes, is he goes through a history of Western philosophy, and some of his ideas seep into that reading, but he rarely says, I think this. So, when he's talking about Mill and Marx, he lectures for 5 days on Fichte. So he goes through all, 3 days on Hegel, 3 days on Marx, 4 days on Kant. So when he goes through all these thinkers, you get this idea that he's kind of working out how they overcorrect. They either say community is the main thing, the ontologically primary, or individualism, think in the utilitarian phase, in the West. And so, he kind of, at some points, he says, there is no wholesale opposition between the individual and the group. And so he kind of postulates these things as a dialectic. Now, what I find fascinating about Ambedkar, and you got a little bit about that today in my talk with the idea of personality and the whole critique of karma as disabling agency and will. I think Ambedkar takes that kind of connection of the individual and society, but instead of like a dialectic, he sees it as a seesaw, a balance beam. You can press down on the individual side and move community. And that's why he puts so much effort into his conversion and making it such a public event and his followers' conversion. And like his speeches were like they're talking directly to these people. They say, "Today you make this decision." Now, he was saying that to 30,000 people at a conference. But notice the appeal to a hearer was very personal. I have this important decision I need to make about, do I stay within the folds of Hinduism or do I convert to Buddhism, which is a risky thing. So, for that day and time. And so, this is Ambedkar working out this kind of resistance to just Dewey giving this blasé metaphysical reading of the individual and society. And Bedkar is saying, yeah, I see the logic to that, but the individual side can really leverage the other side in a way Dewey never thought. Dewey had no conversion campaign. He didn't tell people like you do this philosophical move and you could change everything. And us today, when we look at pragmatism, right, Tad, we would say the good pragmatism would be one that reads structures of oppression right. We talk about racism, structural inequality. But notice Ambedkar resists our modern instincts. Caste is a notion, it's a state of mind. And he solves the problem of caste oppression supposedly by converting to a new religion. Today, we would find that as just an, very odd, if not objectionable move, right? Solve racism by converting to social gospel Christianity. We'd say that's a form of victim blaming. So Ambedkar's philosophy is so wonderful in the things that we might say are good philosophy, and it's so wonderful in the novel things that strike us as not the moves we would make, but then you see the reason for them. I don't know. That's my rambling response. Your question is very provocative.
Good, good. Other questions, comments? Ted?
Oh,
Done?
there's a hand up over there with
Where?
Shad.
Oh, Shad. Hey, there you go.
Go from Tad to Shad here.
All right. Yes, yes.
Yeah, hey, I was gonna ask, I I mean it seems to me, maybe I'm misreading this, that his goal was to kind of reform the caste system, and he may have been just kind of leveraging ideas that he found here in pragmatism or there in Buddhism for that one purpose. And I wonder if his actual philosophy has any great value apart from that specific context of eliminating the caste system. I mean, is it valuable to us today, for example? So that would be
Yeah,
my
yeah.
question.
This is a great question, Shad, because this is, my next book is gonna, I gotta write it, but it's called Ambedkar and the Gospel of Democracy. But I want to take him as a theorist of democracy. And for so many people that value him, even as a philosopher, they value him simply as an anti-caste philosopher. Now, there's a logic to that because Ambedkar, for his whole life, was pinched by the caste system and wanted to double back and reconstruct that. So, this of course changes in the 1920s. He was trying to critique caste with Gandhi's picture on the pandal behind him. And he was part of that movement. Then he breaks with Gandhi, but throughout his whole life, he wanted to fix caste. And, the message of how to do this changes. Eventually, it's leave the fold of Hinduism. But what's fascinating is there's a reading of Ambedkar in his philosophy that's independent of the struggles against caste. And in some ways, I think that's the story we need to make prominent in some of our work because what holds Ambedkar back is he is seen as just an anti-caste thinker. He's just a Dalit. intellectual. And these are very pejorative reactions. Even when people try to praise him, these are pejorative reactions because it boxes him in. So, for instance, in the 1950s, I didn't get into this in this talk. I have a whole nother book planned on Ambedkar's Buddhism. But, in the 1950s, he gives a series of very important high-profile speeches at World Federation of Buddhist conferences. Now, these are conferences that are populated by Buddhist, believers, intellectuals. Almost all of them are not affected by caste. Probably they don't care about caste. Some of them, like the one in Nepal at the end of his life, was the first Buddhist get convening that had 20 or so nations from the Soviet bloc. So at these moments, right, he starts talking about Buddhism as a great philosophy or Buddhism as needing reform. He talks for these audiences in a different way than he talks about Buddhism to the people that are pinched by caste. And one of the features of these talks is he continually, especially at the Nepal one, he literally titles it Buddha and Marx. And he postures the struggle between, communism and the free world. And, in many ways, he's talking about communism versus democracy. But instead of talking about democracy, he talks about Buddhism. So Buddhism becomes this kind of answer to communism that can get the things communism wants, but not incur the extreme cost, namely the cost of fraternity and liberty. His view was quite clear in these speeches. He says Marxist communism of the Russian variety can get us equality, but it cannot get us those other two values. It sacrifices fraternity, right? It sacrifices liberty. It gets equality by killing these people, taking these people's money away, stopping these people's ability to own private property. So Ambedkar dreamed that Buddhism was this philosophy that could balance these three things. Again, justice is a balance among these three qualities. And he says the Buddha's method was one of preaching and persuasion. So, again, the rhetorical aspect. So his Buddhism is fascinating. His Buddhist Bible came out in 1957. 1959, there's an anonymous review in Mahabodhi Journal that says this book should be called Ambedkar and his Dhamma, not Buddha and his Dhamma, because the Buddha's Dhamma is based upon love and peace, and Ambedkar's Dhamma is based upon hate and politics and violence. And so the Buddhists, at least some of them, really reacted strenuously. In some of these speeches on Marx and Buddha, Ambedkar says dukkha, suffering, is poverty. So the first noble truth is redefined as not, life is suffering. No, life, suffering is poverty. And so Ambedkar had this very engaged social gospel that he reads into Buddhism, and many Buddhists reject it. So this is, I think, an important thing for all of us, listening to this. Even if we don't teach pragmatism, add Ambedkar's form of Buddhism to the pantheon of Buddhisms we teach. And I submit to you in many ways, think back to that Adler Blum recollection, where this young student wanted to combine Dewey on democracy with Buddhism. So not just take Dewey, not just take Buddhism, but something new. So that's in many ways in the 1950s, Ambedkar's Buddhism is his pragmatism, and his pragmatism is his Buddhism. So it's this fascinating novelty in many ways.
Yes.
I have a question.
Okay, Naka.
Um, Thank you very much for this very impressive talk. And out of my ignorance,
Thank you.
because I haven't read enough of Ambedkar's books, so I was wondering the scope of navayana pragmatism. And Ambedkar was a Buddhist, and he refers to some moral doctrines or karma. But at the same time, I was wondering uh, to what extent metaphysics, such as Pratitya Samutpada or Tathagata Garbha, or any kinds of Buddhist metaphysics, was intertwined or integrated into his moral philosophy of pragmatism and Buddhism in Ambedkar.
Yeah, this is a great question, and like I said, a lot of it's interesting now. A lot of people are starting to engage even in a more rigorous fashion. What's unique about Ambedkar's Buddhism? Danish Hamid on the call here with us. You're doing great work on this. Others are doing great work. I'm going to try to do some great work. But for instance, if you look at that text, the Buddha and his Dhamma, this is the one that gets published, a year after he dies, but he finished it up about a year before he died. You see him taking seriously so many Buddhist source texts. So there's some things in that text that are, you know, controversial for Buddhists. to take. So, for instance, he gives a very political reading of the Buddha's leaving society and seeking enlightenment. The Buddha suffers the fate of the Dalits and untouchables risked, social boycott. So the Buddha, instead of getting his family socially boycotted because of political decisions they stood behind, he leaves, and then he finds enlightenment. So Ambedkar, in some ways, does some controversial things in there, but other parts of it, you see him wrestling with standard things like impermanence or even the doctrine of karma in this text. And, scholars are writing more and more on this. But for instance, karma is fascinating because, he rejects karma to a certain extent because of its metaphysical use to underlie caste birth, right? But in this book, he can't totally get rid of it because it's such a part, it's like nirvana, it's a part of the Buddhist story. So you see nirvana in the book, but he only mentions it about 5 or 6 times in a 300-page book. It's not the sole piece in it because then he'd be encouraging the people he complained about in the 1950s, the world, 1954, the Buddhist monks had come out for 10 minutes, mumble through a sermon, and then go back to meditating inside their sangha. They're not powerful orators, he said. They're not leaders of the people. But, in karma, same treatment. You see him say, oh, karma is a scientific fact. The material that composes you, lives on in another form even after your death. So he gives a very naturalistic, materialist reading of karma. Uh, but you get the feeling that he doesn't build up karma as much as so many Indian schools of thought did, which is girding the conditions of different lives in samsara or something like that. He gives this deflationary reading of some of these terms. So, and looking at the backstory, I still have to think more about this. He had tons of books on Buddhism. That's why I say no modern author is more represented than Dewey. I mean, if you count any book on some aspect of Buddhism, he probably had more books on Buddhism, but they're all the Pali Society translations in English. So, he had a ton of books on Abhidhamma, on, different ways, Japanese Buddhism, he had a book on. I remember, some of these are underlined. I think there's more to be said about his reception of Buddhism. And like I said, I'm trying to figure it out. Other people are ahead of me on this, but, it's controversial. But one thing I want to insist, to understand what he's doing with Buddhism, you got to know about his pragmatism because his pragmatism is all about reconstruction, selective appropriation. And in 1936 and in 1950, different spots. One, he's talking about caste critique. Another one, he's talking about Buddha and the future of his religion. Both times he says the key move is to not take tradition as it is, wholesale, chip and chop. 1950, he even says the Buddha gave his followers license to chip and chop at the Buddhist tradition and take only the living wood and get rid of the dead wood. And so, that if you know the story of pragmatism and Dewey's philosophy of reconstruction, and the critique of ideals as not timeless but as tools, you see what Ambedkar is doing with Buddhism in a different light, I think. He's very much engaging Buddhism like a pragmatist should. What's useful here? What do I leave behind?
We've got a lot of engagement here. Forgive my pronunciation. Ishita, do you have a comment?
Yes. Thank you, Professor Stroud, for such a wonderful session. So, if it's possible, could I just ask 2 questions?
Sure.
So I had one question. You spoke about Dewey's and then Ambedkar's rejection of the transcendental, right? And the idea of him this removing this veil of mystery. And he writes in that, in that particular way, in a way, he's making the unknowable, this idea of that which is divinely given as something that is knowable. So I wanted to, if you could speak to the idea of how do you see the idea of knowledge within your you've placed liberty, fraternity, equality within that context of justice. So where do you see Ambedkar locates the idea of knowledge? So one is I wanted to if you could speak to that. Um, and the other question that I had, because you brought up the question of the soul in the last answer, because one, I mean, if I remember correctly, one of the ways that Ambedkar challenges traditional Buddhist doctrine is he challenges the idea of rebirth, if I remember correctly, within Navayana Buddhism. So I wanted to understand I mean, because you spoke about the soul, and you've also been talking about the human personality. Does Ambedkar say anything about the soul vis-a-vis, you know, will or the human personality that you've been discussing?
Yeah, these are great questions. The first one is a question that I have not fleshed out much on, but it concerns what are the epistemological commitments of Ambedkar, and I think largely they're pragmatist. I mean, you can find in the archives stuff he's written. I believe it's in Boz as well on the laws of evidence. And so he was a lawyer, and so his engagement with proof in the court sittings could be used or leveraged to talk about his epistemology. I would characterize his epistemology as largely, an empiricist one, but like a empiricism of a pragmatist sort. So, if you make a claim about something, will this bear out in experience? That's the standard, view of pragmatists. And this will largely be in court. If you make a claim that someone was married to someone else, you should be able to find the documents to prove it, etc. So you should be able, it leads you to certain ways to verify that. Now, things like ideals, however, I don't think Ambedkar would count as knowledge, and this is a characteristically pragmatist move. Things like ideals don't describe the world. They're more like tools for changing the world. They don't describe how the world is. They make the world how you want it to be. So these are, but like I said, much more can be said on Ambedkar as a philosopher and the epistemology that he brings in. The second question you get is awesome. I love it because the personality thing is fascinating because it's a clear case of something that Dewey left behind. Like in 1888, Dewey penned, this is when Dewey was young and had an awesome mustache, and he was at University of Michigan, and he was all hopped up on Hegel. And, he wrote this great piece, his first piece, and it's on political thought called The Ethics of Democracy. And there he talks about democracy as a spiritual way of associating with others. So not a form of government, but a spiritual mode of associating. And he talks about personality. The highest ideal of democracy is personality, and Dewey connects personality to liberty, equality, fraternity. Fast forward to when Ambedkar saw Dewey in person and all the books he later buys of Dewey. None of that Dewey, talks like that. It's only young Dewey that talks like that. So Dewey kind of leaves that behind. But what's fascinating is Ambedkar, through his whole life, keeps coming back to that term of personality at various places. And he keeps coming back to that 1888 text. In 1954, we have letters where he's bugging this student, a Dalit student in London, V.B. Kadam, at London School of Economics. And he keeps writing, and this poor student, he's so dedicated to Ambedkar. Ambedkar sends him letters with lists of books to buy, and then Ambedkar says, I'll pay you. And the student goes and gets them and dutifully sends them back to India. And one series of letters, Ambedkar says, hey, I'm writing a book on democracy in India. Can you send me Dewey's short book on democracy? It'll only take you a day to copy out in the British Library. And so the student goes and copies something, sends it back, and the next letter Ambedkar sends to him and says, no, 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 that's not the book, the book on democracy that I wanted. It's the wrong book. The one I wanted begins with Dewey's critique of Sir Henry Maine. And if you know Dewey, that's Ethics of Democracy. And then eventually the kid sends Ambedkar Ethics of Democracy. And what I found out is from the archives, that first one that he sent him was Dewey's essay from 1939, Creative Democracy, which is the first real use of democracy as a way of life that Dewey uses. He never uses that term in 1916, Democracy in Education. So again, 1954, early in his life, when he's a student, he's probably, both of these times, he's getting that 1888 Ethics of Democracy that uses the ideal of personality. So he keeps coming back to it, but Dewey doesn't stick with it. And it's not a metaphysical term. It doesn't track our soul or anything. Ambedkar doesn't talk like that. Dewey doesn't talk like that. It's this ideal sense, right? Strictly speaking, in Dewey's reading from the 1890s, personality emerges between the impulses of an individual and the affordances of a social position. So if I love drawing and imagining new shapes, yet I'm forced to do a job of data entry, there's the mismatch between social position and my outgoing impulses. And that's not going to lead to my flourishing, or in early Dewey speak, that's not going to lead to the development of my personality. So it's very much kind of a description of a state that's taken to be ideal, but it's not coterminous with a soul or anything like that. I don't know if that helps. Sorry to be so long-winded.
It does. Thank you so much.
No problem. See,
Danish.
Danish has his hands up.
Yes, yes, Danish.
Yeah, hi, Scott. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering when you were speaking about the pragmatist reconstruction of Buddhism and Ambedkar's selective appropriation of Buddhism, but you at the same moment spoke about conversion to Buddhism. And I'm sure you know about this, and I've written about this and sent you some of my work, which says, can we really call it conversion if he's selectively appropriating it, reconstructing? Isn't it a different sort of a beast altogether? It's not classical Buddhism anymore. So he's converting to something else, right? Something of his own
Yeah.
making. And a thought that came to my mind was that in the early 20th century, a lot of Indians were reading Comte and Comte, Auguste Comte, and
Yeah.
John Stuart Mill, and all these people who spoke about this religion of humanity. Tagore comes to mind, and some other Acharya Narendra also writes a reconstruction of Buddhism from his own perspective, who was the leader of the Indian Gandhian socialists, by the way. So maybe we can see Ambedkar as being in the same tradition in some sense, that he's trying to create a religion of humanity, a religion of man for his Dalit followers, but for all comers who would want to move away from traditional religion. Because in the speech that you mentioned, which is Mukti Kaun Pathe, I think,
Yeah.
which way is salvation? He says that religion is not about God, religion is about man. And he says something and he explains that. So I wonder what you think about that thought. Yeah.
Yeah, you're definitely right. And in some ways, his Buddhism is a new thought, form of thought. But oftentimes, Ambedkarites will want to say it's just Buddhism. It's not navayana. But so there's some political wrangling over this term, and I see the logic to it. But philosophically, like if we want to say there's all these different, forms of Buddhism, yeah, Ambedkar is clearly doing something different with his. It's a social gospel. It's calibrated to enliven individuals to improve their situation, improve society. It's not calibrated for individual pursuit of enlightenment, or release. So yeah, he definitely has this social aspect to it. But there's so many paradoxes. But yeah, you do some great work on this. Other people are doing great work on it. There's so much one of the questions I continually come back to is, what's the relationship between Buddhism and democracy? Like, can you only be a social democracy if you're all Buddhist? And he talks like that later in his life, but I think, that's just an impossible argument to sustain. I don't, so that in some ways, this is my emerging kind of view of Ambedkar as a democratic theorist. He has a secular philosophy of democracy, social democracy, that's separable from Buddhism. So you notice today, like I talk about the ideal of social democracy and those three values without much reference to Buddhism. Other people will talk about those values, but only as they fit into samatha and the sangha and such. So I think this is part of the complexity of his Buddhist reconstruction, is he not only annoys some people, but he's doing something different with it at different times. And and this I think some people come to Ambedkar and say, I can't see his philosophy wholesale. He must not be a philosopher. Or they say there's some tensions in it. He must not be a philosopher. I think these are bad reactions. I think his value, Kant's value, Dewey's value is their complexity and the tensions, not their uniformity and simplicity. So yeah, his Buddhism is definitely the tip of the spear of, what is he up to and how does he do this? I don't know. Those are some thoughts.
Thank
Right.
you. Thank you. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up with what Danish said. I have sort of similar critique of the idea of calling this a conversion. It's not sort of a normal
Yeah.
kind of conversion. And we was talking about creating a new religion of humanity. I was thinking of also another analogy. Your discussion of Ambedkar's career sounds very similar in a lot of ways to Mordecai Kaplan. Specifically, actually, you talked about pragmatism as being a kind of reconstruction. Kaplan basically created a new kind of Judaism called Reconstructionism, based upon Deweyan pragmatism. or at least very heavily influenced, inspired by it.
Mm.
And I think it'd be interesting to compare those two thinkers, and maybe with what Danish was saying in the context of this early 20th century movement towards a religion of humanity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And your question there, Jason's, I should have said more to Dinesh's point on conversion, but yeah, I have seen no other thinker, maybe Kaplan's the thinker I need to read more of, but no other thinker where the philosophy combines with like the conversion activism. And so you think about it for a second, right? Ambedkar's pragmatism, his philosophy, is a philosophy of trying to reclaim the dignity of the human individual, the agent. Communities for Ambedkar would be formed of individuals. I think he would think it's awful to say caste oppresses communities and end there. Who really feels the pain are the individual members that are. So conversion is, both a group thing and an individual action. And, so conversion is this fascinating novelty. You don't see Kant or Dewey work conversion into their philosophical system, in any way close to this. And also, you see conversion as a very clear operationalization of Ambedkar's philosophical commitments to agency, willfulness, and personality. So, I love looking at the 1950s with Ambedkar because you see he's built up this philosophical edifice with tensions and changes, but that's trying to reclaim human personality, the worth of the individual. And, by 1956, when he converts in that dusty field in Nagpur, he says the way to do this is for you to stand up or me to stand up and convert to, Buddhism. And so, yeah, personality is this philosophical abstract value, but it becomes this very real flesh and blood thing when it's an individual demanding respect, outside of caste labels and their pejorativeness. So yeah, his philosophy and his activism merge so clearly in some ways in his own person too, right? He's the first one to convert, and then he says, if you want, you all can follow me, after I convert. And so then 500,000 stand up. And so the conversion moment is fascinating, and a lot of people will mark it as not part of his philosophy, but I think it very much is a philosophical aspect to Ambedkar's, whole story, because it's the entailment of his philosophy.
Certainly, certainly. Well, this is a very vigorous and fruitful discussion. We're going to have to wrap this up, but thank you all for coming. Thank you, Scott, for doing this banger of a presentation. So we
Thanks.
invite you all to visit www.asianpragmatism.org. Sign up for our mailing list, get about our webinar series.